So a pretty common question that I get asked, especially when you're dealing with investments and real estate, what is the difference between an LP and an LLC? They're both pretty common forms that people hear about. So I'm going to go through a little bit of some of the differences between them. So what exactly is an LP or an LLC? People hear these terms, but they don't really know exactly what they mean. An LP is a limited partnership. LLC is a limited liability company. They're both legal entities that are formed typically by a filing with the Secretary of State in whatever state you're forming in. So if you're forming a Delaware LLC, you form, basically you file something with the Delaware Secretary of State that creates the LLC. That's the initial step to create it. Same thing with a limited partnership. You have a filing with the Secretary of State. So if it's in Arizona or Texas or Nevada, you file it with their Secretary of State. So basically they're just legal entities that are used for whether it's an investment or an operating company. They're different forms of a legal entity instead of a corporation, essentially. And it avoids double taxation because a corporation is taxed at the corporate level, a corporate income tax. And then when it makes distributions of profit or dividends in a corporate sense to its shareholders, those are taxed at the shareholder level. So you have double taxation with a corporation versus an LLC or a limited partnership are taxed differently, typically. So what are the main differences? So if I want to do a real estate investment or start a hedge fund or private equity fund, do I want to do an LLC or an LP? You can really use either, and they both can be used in a lot of ways. There's flexibility in both. A limited partnership or an LLC can be used as a fund to invest in. LPs have been around for a lot longer. An LLC is a creation of statute, and only over the last 20 or 30 years have they become more prevalent. Previously, limited partnerships were the main way that people invested into various types of investments. So the LLC has gotten more popular because it's very flexible. So an LLC can be treated in lots of different ways, depending on how it's structured. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly like a limited partnership, but it can have a lot of the same features. In terms of the number of owners, an LLC can be created just with one owner. It can be a single member LLC, or it can have multiple members, 2, 3, 10, 50, how many ever you need. An LP, a limited partnership, in order for it to be created, it has to have a limited partner and a general partner. So there's a minimum of 2 owners that have to be part of a limited partnership for it to be formed. But there's no limit on, you can have 50 or 100 limited partners or 5 general partners. It's pretty flexible in how you set that up. One of the biggest issues or the reasons that people use LPs and LLCs is liability protection. So there's a level of protection so that your personal assets are not subject to investor lawsuits, creditors coming after you, things like that. So an LP, you have to have a limited partner and a general partner involved as owners. So the general partner of a limited partnership has unlimited liability. So if the general partner is John Smith of this LP, and something happens and the LP gets sued, they can go after the general partner, John Smith, personally and all of his assets. So that's why typically in an LP structure, you'll see an LLC created to become the general partner. So that if anyone goes after the general partner, they sue the LLC, not the individual. So it makes it a little bit more complex of a structure that you need in order to form an LP properly. An LLC, you can have liability protection for every single person. There is no general partner. You can have a manager, but the manager has liability protection. You don't have to have that separate LLC. A lot of times in things like real estate syndications, we will create a separate LLC for the manager as a manager entity, just for an additional layer of protection, but it's not technically required. In terms of management, a limited partnership, the general partner has pretty much complete control. Limited partners might have some voting rights or other rights that are outlined, but generally the general partner is the one in complete control of how that company is operated. An LLC can be managed by its owners, which are called members, or you can elect manager, a board of managers with multiple. You can have officers, you can delegate certain responsibilities to. So it's pretty flexible otherwise with an LLC versus an LP where it's basically just the general partner. Taxation, essentially most of LLCs and LPs are just taxed as partnerships with multiple owners. An LLC with one member might be a disregarded or single member LLC. But otherwise, LLCs with multiple members, the default is they're taxed as a partnership. Now, an LLC can make an election to be taxed like a C Corp or an S Corporation. So it has some flexibility there, whereas an LP generally is just always going to be taxed as a limited partnership, or sorry, a partnership for tax purposes. And the governing documents are going to be pretty similar if you look at them, but technically an LLC is covered by a company or operating agreement, limited liability company agreement, and a partnership is the limited partnership agreement. And those are just written documents that outline management, ownership, rights, responsibilities of the owners and managers of the company. But otherwise, they're very similar in look, just the name is going to be different, operating agreement versus LP or limited partnership agreement. So that's just kind of a quick summary of some of the main differences, although they're very similar and can be used sometimes interchangeably. Sometimes people with an LLC will talk about the LPs, the investors, even though technically they're not LPs, they are just members of an LLC.